The heavy oak doors of the Ironmore Great Hall did not merely open, they groaned under the weight of an oncoming winter. Lyra did not flinch when the strike came. That was the detail the elders would whisper about in the dark corners of the pack house for winters to come. A blind Omega, her sightless white eyes staring into a void no one else could see, standing perfectly still in the center of the flagstone floor. She held a rusted iron bucket, the freezing water sloshing against her scarred shins. The floor was slick with grime, and when Searing's palms split the silence of the hall, cracking violently against Lyra's pale cheek, the girl did not collapse. She did not whimper. She merely tilted her head, her silver white hair spilling over her shoulders like moonlight over stone. At that exact heartbeat, the temperature in the room plummeted. The fires dancing in the massive hearths died down to choked blue embers. Every warrior, beta, and elder in the room felt their blood turn to ice before their minds could comprehend the pressure entering the atmosphere. Alpha Corden, broad-shouldered and dominant, dropped instantly to his knees, his forehead pressing against the wet stones. Next to him, Searing's breath caught in her throat, her hand still raised in the air, frozen by an absolute authority that demanded total submission. Through the threshold stepped Valerius, the Alpha King. His presence was a physical, crushing weight, his golden eyes burning with a lethal brilliance. He did not wear his crown as a mere decoration. It was a jagged ring of dark iron that seemed to bind the very sky to his will. Yet, as his gaze swept past the kneeling nobility of Ironmore, it locked onto the sightless girl standing in the center of the hall. He did not rush to her side with comfort. Instead, his jaw tightened into a cruel, unyielding line. Valerius marched forward, his heavy leather cloak sweeping across the damp floor, and gripped Searing's raised wrist midair. He did not look at Searing. His eyes remained fixed on Lyra's scarred, beautiful face. Who allowed this broken creature to stand in my presence? Valerius's voice was a low, resonant rumble that shook the foundations of the stone walls. It was not a question of protection. It was an interrogation of disgust. He looked at Lyra's blind eyes, her frail form wrapped in threadbare rags, and the ancient bond in his chest sparked with absolute revulsion. A king does not accept a defective mate. The world always woke in agonizing stages for an Omega. Long before the sun could bleed its pale gray light through the towering pines of the Ironmore territory, Lyra was already moving. The pack house was a monolithic structure of dark stone and blood-red banners, a place where power was the only currency and weakness was a death sentence. To the rest of the pack, Lyra was nothing more than an invisible piece of furniture, a tool to be used until it broke. Since the age of 7, when her mother had perished in the freezing mud and her father had been driven into the wilderness as a disgraced exile, Lyra had known nothing but the weight of the iron bucket. Her hands were permanently stained red from the biting chill of the well water and the coarse hemp rope. She had memorized every cracked tile, every groaning step in the pack house, navigating the darkness of her own blindness with a terrifying grace. She moved like water, flowing through the lowest channels, ensuring she never crossed the paths of those who looked down on her from the upper balconies. Alpha Corden ruled Ironmore with a loud, booming laugh that carried no warmth, only oppression. To him, Lyra was an asset that cost nothing to maintain and yielded endless labor. He had never spoken a direct word to her, only barking orders to the head cook to ensure the blind girl kept the hearths burning. Below cordon were the ambitious betas, a pack of wolves who fought over scraps of favor like rabid beasts. And at the absolute pinnacle of those betas was Searing. Searing did not walk. She glided through the corridors with the absolute certainty of a future queen. She was stunning, possessing a sharp, aristocratic beauty that masked a venomous heart. For years, Searing had calculated her ascent, keeping her lineage clean and her reputation flawless, knowing that the Alpha King would one day seek a female worthy of his throne. When Searing entered the kitchens that morning, her amber eyes immediately found Lyra, her lips curling into a sneer of pure disdain. To Searing, the blind Omega was a stain on the pack's pride, a creature that should have been cast out to the rogues long ago. When darkness finally claimed the pack house, Lyra retreated to the only sanctuary she possessed, a cramped, forgotten storage room at the end of the lower cellar. It was a place filled with broken wooden shelves, rotting ropes, and the suffocating scent of ancient dust. No one came here. No one wanted the useless remnants of the past. Lyra sat on the cold earthen floor, pulling her knees to her chest as the silence enveloped her. She closed her sightless eyes, and then, as it did every midnight, the phenomenon began. Beneath the scarred skin of her palms, a soft, ethereal silver light began to pulse. It did not burn. It radiated a profound, ancient warmth that seemed to heal the microscopic fractures in her soul. The light grew brighter, swirling beneath her skin like liquid starlight trapped in glass. Outside the high stone window of the cellar, deep within the shadow of the pine trees, an unseen entity watched the silver glow. The creature did not move, its dark silhouette blending into the forest, but it recognized the divine radiance. Lyra did not know that her blindness was a veil, a self-imposed trial. She did not know that she was the moon goddess incarnate, walking among mortals to test the purity of their hearts. And so far, the wolves of the earth were failing. The decree had arrived on cream paper, sealed with the black wax of the royal crest. The Alpha King was conducting his grand inspection of the 5 territories. For 6 days, Iron Moor had been thrown into a frenzy of terrified productivity. Banners were scrubbed, the gravel paths were raked into perfect geometric lines, and the warriors trained until their muscles tore. Alpha Cordon spent fortunes on imported meats and fine wines, desperate to present his pack as an indomitable fortress. Searing had spent those 6 days rehearsing her perfection. She chose a gown the color of spilled blood, tailored to accentuate her curves, and practiced her posture in front of the grand mirrors until her smile was a weapon of absolute poise. She knew exactly where she would stand in the Great Hall, 3 paces to the right of Alpha Cordon, where the morning sun would hit her hair at the perfect angle. She would be the vision that captured the king's heart. But on the morning of the arrival, Lyra was still in the hall, trying to finish scrubbing the center tiles. The water in her bucket was gray and freezing. She heard the sharp, rhythmic click of Searing's heels before the beta even entered the room. "What is this filth doing here?" Searing's voice cut through the empty hall like a razor. "You are leaving streaks on the stone where His Majesty will walk."
You are a disgusting, blind blight upon this pack.
Get out of my sight before I have the guards throw your carcass into the woods." "I was ordered to finish the center floor," Lyra replied softly, her voice steady, devoid of the fear Saren so desperately desired.
Saren stepped forward,
her face contorting with rage as she noticed the pack elders and warriors beginning to gather at the edges of the hall to watch the spectacle. Alpha Corden stood at the dais, watching with absolute indifference. Saren could not let an Omega defy her in public. With a snarl, she brought her hand down across Lyra's face. The impact echoed like a cracking whip against the stone walls. Lyra's head snapped to the side, her silver hair blinding her temporarily, but she did not fall. She stood her ground, the left side of her face burning crimson, her sightless eyes turning slowly back to focus on the space where Saren stood. There was no anger in Lyra's expression, only a profound, hollow sadness that seemed to stretch into eternity. Before Saren could strike a second time, the heavy iron doors flew open. Valerius entered like a storm of dark majesty, his golden eyes sweeping the room before locking onto the scene. He marched down the center aisle, catching Saren's wrist with a grip that nearly crushed her bones. Saren gasped, a smile of triumphant anticipation forming on her lips, believing the king was defending her honor from the presence of a slave. Instead, Valerius pushed Saren aside as if she were nothing more than a nuisance. He stepped closer to Lyra, his shadow completely eclipsing her frail form. The ancient mate bond snapped into place between them, a golden thread of destiny connecting the sovereign of wolves to the lowest Omega. But as Valerius looked at her sightless white eyes and her scarred, frail hands, his heart hardened with an arrogant pride. "You?" Valerius whispered, his voice dripping with venomous disgust. "The heavens dare to bind me, the Alpha King, to a broken, useless piece of trash? A blind Omega who cannot even see the throne she is meant to share?" The great hall fell into a suffocating, horrified silence. Saren's eyes widened with a mixture of shock and malicious delight. Alpha Corden remained on his knees, his breath hitching. Valerius stepped back, his golden eyes flashing with absolute rejection. "I, Valerius, Alpha King of the 5 territories, reject you, Lyra of Ironmoor, as my mate. You are a blemish upon my bloodline." "You are nothing to me." Lyra stood perfectly still as the words tore through the air. The rejection of a true mate was meant to break a wolf's soul, to drive them to madness or death. But as the golden bond shattered into pieces of phantom light, Lyra did not scream. A single tear, pure and clear as crystal, escaped her left eye and tracked down her bruised cheek. As the tear hit the cold stone floor, a sound like a fracturing bell echoed through the spiritual plane. "I accept your rejection, Your Majesty," Lyra said, her voice changing. It was no longer the soft, submissive whisper of an Omega. It was a multi-toned, resonant melody that seemed to vibrate from the earth itself. She turned her back on the king, ignoring the gasp of the crowd as she walked toward the open doors. With every step she took away from Valerius, the silver light beneath her skin began to bleed outward, illuminating her form until she looked like a celestial being walking among mortals. She stepped through the threshold, leaving the pack house behind. And as her form vanished into the dark pine forest, the sky opened up, a blood-red moon tearing through the clouds.
Instantly, an agonizing scream ripped through Valerius's throat.
He fell to his knees, clutching his chest as a searing pain blacked out his vision. Around him, Alpha Corden, Saren, and every single warrior in the hall collapsed into the dirt, howling in pure terror. The wolf spirits within them were being ripped away, torn out by an invisible divine hand. The primordial connection to the moon was severed. The cursed bond had fallen upon them.
They were no longer wolves. They were merely fragile, powerless humans, trapped in a world of monsters, stripped of their shifting forms forever. The weeks that followed were a descent into living purgatory for the Ironmore Pack and the entire Dominion. Without their wolf forms, the warriors could no longer defend the borders. The scent of weakness drew the feral rogues and rival vampire clans to the edges of the territory like vultures to a carcass. The great full moon battle was approaching, a night where the neighboring Eclipse Pack would march across the borders to slaughter them all. And Valerius's people had nothing but mortal steel to defend themselves.
Valerius sat in his empty throne room, his crown heavy and mocking upon his brow. His golden eyes had grown dull, his muscular frame trembling with the phantom ache of a beast that no longer existed. He had searched the records, consulted the dying ancient seers, and the truth had finally crushed his pride into dust. The blind Omega he had despised was the moon goddess herself, down from the heavens to find a king worthy of her grace. And he had rejected her. With the full moon rising tonight, signaling the total annihilation of his kingdom, Valerius knew there was only one choice left. He stripped himself of his royal armor, wearing nothing but a plain linen tunic, and began his long, a humiliating trek to the Forgotten Lands, the mythical valley of ice and stone where the spirits were said to sleep. The journey was a brutal testament to his mortality. His feet bled against the sharp rocks, his lungs burned in the freezing air, and without his wolf's healing factor, every scratch remained an open, agonizing wound. He crawled the final miles through the snow, his pride entirely broken, until he reached the center of the frosted clearing. There, standing upon a dais of pure ice, was Lyra. She was no longer wearing rags. She was draped in a gown of woven moonlight, her silver hair floating around her as if she were submerged in water. Her sightless eyes were gone, replaced by glowing pools of pure cosmic silver that held the weight of 1,000 galaxies. Valerius collapsed into the snow at her feet, his hands trembling as he dragged himself forward to touch the hem of her gown. He prostrated himself completely, his forehead pressed into the freezing ice, weeping tears of bitter, absolute regret. "Forgive me, my Luna," Valerius choked out, his voice breaking with a despair that no king should ever know. "Save my people from the slaughter. Take my life, take my soul, but break the curse. Forgive me, my Luna." Lyra looked down at the broken ruler, her expression as cold and beautiful as the stars above. She glided forward, her bare feet leaving no imprints in the snow. She reached down, her slender, glowing fingers gently running through his matted, dark hair. The touch was devoid of warmth,
a terrifying reminder of her divine detachment.
"The pride of a king is a heavy burden, Valerius," she whispered, her voice echoing through the wind. "You looked at my blindness and saw weakness, never realizing that it was your own heart that could not see. The curse remains. Your arrogance is the price your kingdom must pay, your majesty." So long she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe fully. Recognition. That was the only word for it, inadequate as it was. Her fingers knew the shape of those markings before her eyes finished reading them. Her blood seemed to lean toward the carved wood the way a compass leans north. Not a choice, not a thought, simply an orientation. A pointing toward. She pulled her hand back, pressed it flat against her knee, stared at the token on the bed cover in front of her like it had spoken. It had not, of course. It was a piece of wood. It was nothing. It meant nothing. She picked it up again within seconds. Hours passed. The pack house settled into its nighttime quiet around her. The particular silence of a building full of sleeping wolves. Breathing slow, guard shifts minimal. Outside her door, she could hear Riven's steady presence. Beyond the window, the iron moor pines stood dark against a sky scattered with cold stars. She was still holding the token when it began. It started at her fingertips. A romantic woman. A warmth, not external, not from the wood, but from inside her own skin, rising from somewhere so deep she could not locate its origin. She looked down at her hand and watched the light come. Silver. The same silver that had visited her nightly in the storage room and vanished before she could catch it. But not like that. Not shy, not brief, not uncertain of itself. This time it came like it had been waiting. It moved from her fingers to her palm to her wrist, spreading and branching patterns beneath her skin like veins of moonlight. Steady, pulsing intensely, overwhelmingly alive. It reached her arms, her collarbone, her face. She could feel it behind her eyes. She could feel it in the soles of her feet. The last thing she remembered was looking at the window and seeing her own reflection in the dark glass, luminous, unrecognizable, lit from within like something the night had no category for. Then, nothing. In the corridor, Commander Riven had been awake. He was always awake. It was less a discipline than a condition, the particular alertness of a man who had survived his life by never fully surrendering consciousness. He sat with his back against the wall beside Lyra's door, arms folded, breathing steady. He saw the light before he understood what he was seeing. It came from under the door in a thin, bright line, then widened as it intensified, bleeding across the floorboards in both directions, filling the corridor with a cold silver radiance that had no business existing inside a pack house in the middle of the iron moor night. He was on his feet without deciding to stand. His hand went to his side without deciding to move. Every instinct he had, and Commander Riven had very finely calibrated instincts, was screaming something at him. Not alarm, exactly, but its close cousin. Awe. The specific awe of recognizing something so far above your rank that all your training becomes temporarily irrelevant. He stood in that silver light for 30 seconds. Then it faded. He did not open the door. His orders did not include opening the door. He stood in the returning darkness for a long moment,
then pressed his back against the wall.
Slid slowly down it until he was seated again, and sent a message to the palace that contained considerably more than one word this time. At the royal palace, Valerius was not sleeping either. He stood at the window of his private study, a large room that managed, despite its size, to feel like a space built for one person to be alone in, and looked out at the dark that pressed against the glass. His hands were loose at his sides. His expression was the one his council had learned to be cautious about. Not cold, not distant, but interior, occupied with something they could not see and he would not share. His wolf was quiet. That was the thing. That was the enormous, bewildering thing he could not stop turning over in his mind. Since his 18th year, the year the lichen bloodline announced itself inside him like a second heartbeat, restless and ancient and constantly searching, he had not known a quiet night. The bloodline wanted what it wanted. It had always wanted. It did not rest. It did not settle. It moved through his sleep like a current through dark water, pulling towards something it could not find, growing more insistent with every passing year. Tonight, it was still, completely, profoundly, inexplicably still. Like something that had been searching for a very long time had finally been able to stop. He heard the knock at the study door without turning. Come. His council filed in, 4 of them, which meant they had been waiting, had coordinated, had decided collectively that this conversation needed to happen tonight. He recognized the formation. He had seen it before at treaty discussions and border crises. They had prepared. The Northern Alliance needed a decision. Lord Fenrath's daughter was available and politically advantageous. The Eastern Pacts were watching the question of the king's succession with increasing anxiety. The stability of the entire 5-territory dominion was, in the carefully chosen words of his chief council member, intimately connected to the question of a chosen mate. Valerius listened to all of it. His wolf stayed quiet throughout. When they finished, he thanked them, told them he would consider everything they had raised. Then he looked at them with the particular quality of attention that had ended arguments before they began. And they filed back out with the careful movements of people who understood they had not made the progress they came for. The door closed. In the armchair at the back of the study, Elder Voss had not spoken once during the entire exchange. He was a small man, slight, silver-haired, older than anyone in the palace could reliably confirm. He had served 2 kings before Valerius. He understood power the way cartographers understand geography, not by moving through it dramatically, but by reading it precisely, patiently, from the right distance. He watched Valerius turn back to the window. He watched the set of his shoulders, the quality of his stillness, the careful absence of expression that meant the most was being felt. Voss said nothing aloud, but when he left the study 30 minutes later, he walked directly to the palace's lower archive and began pulling records that had not been touched in nearly 2 decades. His old hands moved through the files with practiced efficiency, unhurried, certain of what they were looking for. Records of the last Lichen Queen, records of her final months, records of what and who she had left behind. Neither of them knew, in those separate silences, the king at his window, the old man in the archive, that the test had already been answered. that the wolf token, carved from ancient wood, placed in the hand of a girl who did not know her own name, had done what it was sent to do.
It was not a gift. It was never a gift. Royal lichen blood, when it encountered that particular wood carved in that particular pattern, sealed with that particular lineage, responded in one way and one way only. It answered. It rose. It lit the night from the inside. Lyra had held the token for less than 3 hours. She had lit a corridor so brightly that a seasoned Kingsguard had pressed his back against a wall and forgotten for 30 seconds how to be unimpressed. She had done it in her sleep. She had done it without trying. And in the morning, she would wake with no memory of any of it, only the token, still warm in her palm, and the strange, inexplicable feeling that something in the world had shifted a half degree in a new direction. She was right. It had. Saren did not go to the guard directly. She was too careful for that, too practiced in the particular art of getting what she wanted without leaving fingerprints on the wanting. She went through channels, a beta she had favored with small loyalties over the years, a word passed sideways, a question framed as concern rather than curiosity. By the time the information reached her, it had traveled through enough hands that no one could trace it cleanly back to its source, which was exactly how she preferred things. She received it over breakfast, delivered quietly into her ear by the beta who owed her. And she sat very still for a moment, with her cup halfway to her lips, and the information settling through her like cold water finding cracks in stone, silver light flooding under the door. The guard, shaken enough that he had told someone, which meant he had been frightened enough that caution had lost to the need to be witnessed. She set her cup down. She did not look frightened. She was not frightened, or rather, she took the fear and did what she always did with emotions that threatened to make her weak. She turned it, compressed it, fed it into something more useful. Calculation. If Lyra was somehow significant, if there was something in that gray, hollow-eyed Omega girl that had drawn a king's gaze and produced silver light in a locked room at midnight, then Lyra was not nothing. And if Lyra was not nothing, then Lyra was a problem. And problems, in Saren's experience, were always better handled before they became too large to manage quietly. She went to Alpha Cordon before noon. She framed it carefully. She always framed things carefully. A security concern, she called it. An anomaly that the pack had a responsibility to investigate. Strange energy. Unexplained phenomena. A ward of the pack exhibiting behavior that no one could account for. The king had placed the girl under protection. Yes, but the pack's duty to its own stability surely superseded a vague royal instruction delivered without explanation. She watched Cordon's face while she spoke. She had expected to find skepticism there, or territorial defensiveness, or the particular brand of masculine stubbornness that required her to approach from 3 different angles before he would move. She had prepared for all of those. She had not prepared for what she actually found. He was already afraid. Not of what she was telling him. He knew already. She could see it in the way he did not react to the silver light detail, did not question it, did not ask her to repeat it. He knew. He had known something, at least since before she walked into this room, and he was frightened. In the deep, foundational way of a man who has done something that cannot be undone and has been waiting for a very long time for the consequences to arrive. he agreed with her before she finished speaking. Together, with the door closed and voices low, they began to discuss how to move Lyra out of the pack house without triggering the royal protection order. How to make it quiet. How to make it look like something other than what it was. Saren left the study, feeling for the first time since the king had walked through those doors like she had her footing back. She did not notice, on her way out, the particular stillness of the corridor, the absence of the usual pack house sounds. The way sound could carry in old stone buildings, around corners that seemed solid. She did not notice Commander Riven at the far end of the hall. He had noticed her. Riven did not pace. He did not deliberate. He did not weigh options with the anxious energy of men who were uncertain. He simply assessed, decided, and moved. It was the quality that had made him useful to a king who operated the same way. He returned to his post outside Lyra's chamber, sat down, and composed a message in the particular shorthand he and the king had developed over a decade of shared work, compact, unambiguous, impossible to misread. One word: move. He dispatched it within the hour. Then he settled back against the wall and waited with the patience of someone who understood that the next move was not his. At the palace, Elder Voss did not knock when he entered the king's study. He never knocked. It was one of the few privileges Valerius had never revoked, partly because revoking it would have required a conversation about why. And Voss had a way of making those conversations uncomfortable, in the manner that only extremely honest people could manage. He placed the file on the desk. Valerius looked at it, then at Voss, then back at the file, with an expression that gave nothing away, because he had spent 26 years perfecting an expression that gave nothing away. Voss sat down across from him without being invited and folded his hands on his knee and waited. The file contained 3 pages. Old paper, careful handwriting, the kind of documentation that was never meant to leave the archive it had been buried in. Names, dates, a lineage record that ended where it should not have ended, abruptly, deliberately, with the practiced neatness of someone erasing a thread they hoped no one would follow. A name at the top of the page, the last Lycan queen, and below it, a second entry, a daughter. Age at last confirmed record, 7 years old. Location at time of recording, unverified. Assumed deceased by the king's enemies, never confirmed. Voss let the silence sit for a moment. Then, carefully, he said, "You have seen this before." It was not a question. Valerius did not insult him by pretending otherwise. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and let out a breath that carried more weight than it should have from a man who never visibly carried weight at all. 3 months ago, he said, a contact in the Eastern Archives. It took her 4 years to find it, and 2 more months to get it to me without being intercepted. Voss absorbed this. And Ironmore was the last location the Queen mentioned in the last correspondence we have from her? A name, a pack, no details beyond that. He paused. I needed to see her myself. I needed to be certain before I moved. The old man was quiet for a moment. Outside the study windows, the palace grounds lay in the gray afternoon light, perfectly still. "And are you?" Voss asked. "Certain." Valerius's jaw tightened barely, the smallest movement, visible only to a man who had been reading his face for 8 years. "I knew the moment I walked through the door," he said, "before I saw anything. before I saw her." Voss looked at him steadily. "That is the bond." "Yes."
"You did not expect that."
A pause, longer than the others. "No," Valerius said quietly. "I did not expect that." Because that was the part he had not prepared for. He had prepared for everything else: the search, the politics, the danger of extracting a hidden heir from a hostile pack without triggering the very people who had buried her there. He had made contingency plans and backup contingency plans, and had spent 3 months thinking about every possible version of how this could unfold. He had not planned for the doors of that great hall to open and the bond to hit him like a physical force. Ancient and immediate, and completely indifferent to his carefully constructed composure. He had not planned for his wolf, restless since his 18th year, to go absolutely silent the instant his eyes found her face. He had made a vow to a dying woman 15 years ago, kneeling on cold stone beside a queen who would use the last of her strength to grip his hand and say her daughter's name. He had been 17. He had promised because it was right, because she was dying and frightened, and because some things simply demanded to be promised. He had not imagined, at 17, that the daughter would be his mate. The universe, it turned out, had not asked for his input. Voss watched him with the particular quality of attention that had nothing in it of judgment. Only the careful witnessing of a man who understood that some truths rearrange the room they landed in. Then Riven's message arrived. Valerius read it, set it down, looked at Voss. "How quickly can you be ready to travel?" he said. It happened fast. That was the thing about Commander Riven. He did not build toward action. He did not signal it, or warm up to it, or give anyone the courtesy of anticipating it. One moment, he was a still figure in a corridor. The next, he was moving, and everything in his path either stepped aside or got relocated. He came to Lyra's chamber before dawn. 3 words: "We are leaving." He gave her 4 minutes to gather what she had, which was almost nothing, because Lyra had never been permitted to accumulate anything worth gathering. A worn coat, a change of clothes, the wolf token, which she wrapped in the corner of a cloth and placed at the bottom of the bag without quite being able to explain why she wasn't leaving it behind. 4 minutes, and they were moving through the pack house before the pack was fully awake.
Almost. Alpha Corden was waiting at the bottom of the stairs.
He had positioned himself deliberately, shoulders square, a light expression assembled into something that was trying to be authoritative and landing closer to desperate. 3 of his senior betas flanked him. The message was clear. This was a wall. This was a no.
Riven stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom and looked at him. "Step aside, Alpha."
"She is a ward of this pack." Corden's voice was even, but his eyes moved to Lyra in a way that had nothing protective in it. Any transfer of a pack ward requires the Alpha's written consent and a formal. She is under royal protection by direct order. Riven descended the remaining steps at the same pace. "She has been since the day the king left. If you would like to contest that order, I will have the documentation forwarded to the palace, and the king can address it with you personally when he arrives." He stopped 2 feet from Corden. "Would you like that?" A beat. The betas shifted. Corden's jaw tightened into a hard, ugly line. The expression of a man who understood exactly how exposed he was and had no move left that didn't make it worse. His eyes went to Lyra one more time, and in them she saw something she had never seen directed at her before. Not contempt, not indifference, fear. He stepped aside. The carriage was plain, no royal markings, nothing that announced itself on the road. 2 drivers up front, 2 guards riding alongside. Riven sat across from Lyra as the pack house fell away behind them and the iron-moor pines closed in on both sides. Dense and dark in the gray pre-morning light. She watched the trees pass. Then she looked at him.
Does the king know who I am?
Riven met her eyes. Yes. Am I in danger?
You were in danger before this morning. Less so now. Am I a prisoner? Something moved briefly in his expression. Not quite warmth, but adjacent to it. No. She turned back to the window. The road curved north, away from Ironmoor territory, away from the only world she had known for 7 years. She should have felt more, she thought, relief or grief, or the particular vertigo of a life rearranging itself around her. Instead, she felt very quiet, like the part of her that processed enormous things had simply gone still and was waiting. She reached down and opened her bag. She was not looking for anything specific. The motion was automatic, hands needing something to do while her mind caught up to the morning. She lifted the coat, shook it lightly, checked the pockets out of old habit. Her fingers found the lining. A stiffness there that had no business being there. Not the seam, not a fold of fabric, but something flat and deliberate, tucked into the space between the lining and the outer cloth. She turned the coat over, found the small, nearly invisible stitching along the lower hem that was different from the rest. Newer, more careful, done by someone who needed it to hold for a long time and not be found. She pulled the letter free. The paper was thin with age. The seal had been pressed in plain wax. No crest, no marking, nothing that could identify it if it was found by the wrong hands. But the handwriting on the front was not anonymous. It said simply, "My Lyra." She recognized it the way she recognized the silver light, from somewhere below memory, from somewhere that did not need to be taught. Her mother's hand. She broke the seal. She read it once quickly, the way you inhale sharply before understanding what you are breathing. Then she read it again, slowly. Because the first reading had moved too fast through her, and she needed to let each sentence arrive properly before the next one could. Her mother wrote the way she apparently did everything, without wasted words, without the luxury of softness. She had written this knowing she might not have another chance. Every line was precise. Every line mattered. You are not what they told you you were. That was how it began. Not with endearment, not with apology, with the truth, offered immediately, like medicine. The Lycan Queen's bloodline ended with her death. It had been folded small and placed in the lowest possible rank of the lowest profile pack in the Dominion, made invisible, made unthreatening, made into something no one would think to look at twice. It was not abandonment. It was architecture. Her mother had built her a hiding place out of humiliation and obscurity, and she had done it because the alternative was a grave. I made you an Omega so you could survive. I am sorry it cost you what it cost you. I need you to understand, it was the only wall I had left to build,
Lyra's hands were not entirely steady by the third page. She pressed on. The enemies who had moved against the Queen were organized, patient, and had reach inside every level of pack governance. They had been working for years to ensure that the Lycan bloodline ended cleanly, without heirs, without continuation. Her mother had spent her last months understanding exactly how deep the roots of that conspiracy went. She had found the source. She had written the name at the bottom of the final page, not in anger, not surrounded by accusation, just the name. Alone on the last line, the way you write something you need the reader to find without any possibility of misunderstanding. Alpha Cordon of Ironmore Pack. He told them where to find me. He was paid well for it. He kept you after because he needed to know what you were, and because a dead Omega child draws more attention than a living servant. He has been watching you for 7 years to make sure you never became anything worth fearing. Lyra read the name twice. Then she folded the letter, slowly, carefully, along its original creases, folded it the way her mother had folded it, pressing each edge flat with her thumbnail. Lyra held the faded fabric of her old cloak against her chest, staring out into the absolute darkness of the carriage. She could not see the trees passing by, nor the vast, indifferent horizon of the northern territories. But she could feel the heavy, ancient gravity of the land changing beneath the wheels. Her blindness had never been a limitation. It was a veil she chose to wear, a test for a mortal world that had failed her utterly. She did not weep. The tears she had shed on the day of her rejection were the last human tears she would ever possess. When Valerius had cast her out, sneering at her sightless eyes and declaring her an embarrassment to the royal warrior bloodline, those tears had struck the stone floor of the Ironmore Great Hall like liquid silver. And in that exact heartbeat, the divine curse had settled over the entire dominion. Sitting across from her in the carriage, a silent attendant watched her serene face, too terrified to speak. The aura radiating from Lyra was no longer that of a discarded, submissive Omega. It was a suffocating, blinding pressure of pure celestial power, vibrating with the quiet fury of a deity who had been insulted by mere mortals. Outside, the road toward the ancient sanctuary in the Forgotten Lands opened wide beneath the pale, unearthly glow of a gathering storm. The world was shifting. The alignment of the stars was preparing for the ultimate reckoning. The secret Lyra had carried while scrubbing floors and enduring the cruelty of the pack was laid bare to the heavens. She was no longer Lyra, the invisible servant. She was the moon goddess incarnate, and she was returning to her throne to watch the wolves burn in their own arrogance. The sanctuary did not resemble the grand palaces of worldly kings. The sanctuary did not resemble the grand palaces of worldly kings. It was a monolithic structure of dark, primordial stone that seemed to swallow the very concept of time. The towers pierced the heavy clouds like jagged teeth, and the courtyard was silent, completely devoid of the usual bustling pack life. Here, the air itself tasted of ozone and ancient magic. When Lyra stepped down from the carriage, she wore no royal silk. She remained in her simple, coarse gray garments, carrying nothing but her absolute sovereignty. The few ancient guardians standing watch did not challenge her. They fell prostrate before her feet, their foreheads pressing against the freezing stone.
A profound, terrifying hush swept through the grounds, a ripple of instinctive terror that reached every living creature within 100 leagues. Inside the receiving hall, the air was cold despite the massive stone hearth. An old advisor stood by the shadows, trembling as Lyra entered the room. She did not seek a chair. She stood by the narrow window, listening to the distant, desperate howling of wild beasts in the surrounding forests. Beasts that could no longer shift, wolves trapped permanently in human skin, defenseless against the approaching slaughter of the Full Moon Territory War. "Why did they dare to seek me out?" Lyra murmured, her voice carrying the resonance of a shifting tide. The old advisor bowed until his spine cracked. "My Luna, the Alpha King Valerius has crossed the border. He comes with the remnants of his council. They are desperate. The neighboring enemy packs have discovered their weakness. Without their wolves, they will be slaughtered when the moon reaches its zenith tonight." Lyra did not turn around. "Let them come," she commanded softly. "Let them see what their pride has bought." The summons had not been written in ink or sealed with wax. It was a psychological pull, an inescapable divine tether that dragged Valerius and his broken leadership toward the Forgotten Lands. For 3 days, the arrogant Alpha King had been forced to march like a common beggar, his body aching with the heavy, mortal fatigue of a man stripped of his inner beast. Searing had arrived at the outer gates hours before the others, driven by a hysterical, calculating panic. She had dressed in her finest deep green velvet gowns, her hair woven with jewels, desperate to maintain the illusion of her high-born superiority. She believed that with enough charm, with the right words of flattery, she could convince the goddess to restore her status. But the heavy iron gates did not open for her beauty. The guardians looked through her, as if she were a ghost, guiding her without a word to a freezing, empty antechamber on the lower level. There were no refreshments. There was no fire. Searing sat on a stone bench, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her green skirts. The crushing realization was beginning to seep through her immaculate surface. She was no longer the favored beta rival destined for a crown. She was an ordinary, powerless human girl, sitting in the dark, waiting for a judgment she could not escape. On the upper levels of the sanctuary, Lyra was being treated with the reverent terror due to a supreme deity. The ancient guardians did not offer options. They begged to know her slightest desire, yet she requested nothing. She walked the cold corridors with her head held high, her sightless eyes focused on a reality far beyond the physical realm. The old advisor walked beside her, presenting ancient scrolls of divine law and the bloodline covenants that the mortal wolves had broken when they abused the low-ranking and the weak. He explained the technicalities of the cursed bond, how the divine spark could only be restored through absolute, ego-shattering repentance. Lyra absorbed the information silently. She knew the law better than any mortal. She had watched for 7 years as Corden treated the Omegas like disposable garbage, using them until they broke. Laughing his loud, booming laugh while filling rooms with tyrannical pressure. She had watched Valerius turn his back on her, disgusted by her apparent vulnerability. On the afternoon of the second day, Corden arrived. The broad-shouldered leader of the Ironmore pack tried to maintain his steady, commanding pace as he walked down the long corridor toward the central chamber.
But without his wolf, his stride was hollow, his shoulders tense with a primal fear he could no longer mask. As Corden turned the corner with his few remaining guards, he froze. Lyra was standing at the far end of the hall. She was still clothed in gray, but a soft, pulsing silver light was emanating from beneath her skin, casting long, ethereal shadows against the stone walls. Corden stopped entirely. His guards took a step back, their eyes wide with horror. Lyra did not utter a single word. She simply stood there, a blind girl who had once scrubbed his floors, now looking directly toward him with an authority that shattered his soul. For 3 agonizing seconds, Corden tried to hold his ground. Then his eyes flickered away. In all the years of his tyrannical rule over Ironmore, through every casual cruelty he had inflicted upon the weak, he had never once looked away first. Now he scurried past her like a rat in the dark, his escort scrambling to keep up, not daring to look back. Down in the waiting room, Saren heard the heavy footsteps echoing through the stone walls. She heard the hushed, terrified whispers of the passing courtiers. The blind Omega, Lyra, she is the goddess herself, a voice whispered outside the heavy wooden door. She has returned to claim her dominion. Saren did not move. The green velvet of her dress felt like a shroud. Every calculated piece of her ambition, the wolf token she had coveted, the position as Valerius's queen, the petty torments she had inflicted on Lyra, shattered into worthless dust. She remembered the slap she had delivered in the great hall, the way she had mocked Lyra's sightless eyes. A nauseating vertigo seized her, a suffocating weight that crushed the breath from her lungs. She had no next move. There was no strategy for a mortal trying to deceive the moon. The Grand Council Chamber of the Sanctuary was built to host the judgments of gods. The immense stone walls had absorbed centuries of divine decree, holding an absolute, terrifying weight. The 5 broken leaders of the territories sat along the massive stone table, their faces pale, their bodies trembling under the immense spiritual pressure of the room. Valerius sat at the head, though he no longer looked like an elite ruler. His golden eyes were dim, shadowed by dark circles, his royal robes hanging loosely over his exhausted frame. The heavy double doors groaned open. Lyra walked in. She was not announced by trumpets or heralds. She did not hurry. She moved with the slow, inevitable grace of the night sky, carrying the silver light of the cosmos within her very marrow. Valerius did not stand. He could not. The sheer aura of her presence pinned him to his seat, forcing his chin down. "Take your seats," Lyra said, her voice a cool, resonant whisper that vibrated through the stone floor. "The trial of the fallen has begun." The leaders could only stare. Their inner wolves, locked behind the divine curse, scratched frantically at their own minds, screaming in terror at the presence of their creator. Lyra walked to the center of the chamber, refusing to sit. She stood before them as an absolute, undeniable truth. "My name is Lyra," she said, her voice level and devoid of human emotion. "You knew me as a blind servant, an invisible entity to be kicked and mocked. Today, you will understand exactly what you discarded when you chose pride over your sacred bond." She did not present physical evidence or legal documents. Instead, she raised her hand, and the memories of her 7 years of torment materialized in the air above the table. Vivid, glowing projections of silver light. The leaders watched themselves abusing the weak, heard Cordon's cruel laughter, and witnessed Valerius's cold, arrogant rejection of his true mate. "This is a fabrication!" Cordon shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he tried to defend his fading honor. "We did what was necessary for the strength of the packs. An Omega cannot lead. A blind girl cannot—" The silver light flared violently, cutting off his words like a physical blow. Cordon gasped, clutching his throat as he fell to his knees, the pressure in the room expanding until the stone table cracked down the center. "Your strength was an illusion," Lyra said, her sightless eyes fixed precisely on his terrified face. "And your judgment is final." With a single wave of her hand, the king's guard stepped forward, dragging Cordon out of the chamber. He did not fight. He had nothing left to fight with. 10 minutes later, Searing was brought into the room. She attempted to hold her head high, to crawl back into the skin of the proud beta rival she had once been. But she could only manage 4 steps before her legs betrayed her. Her body, recognizing the supreme divinity in the room, collapsed entirely. She fell to her knees on the cold stone floor, her green velvet skirts pooling around her as she wept silently, unable to look up at the goddess she had tormented. Valerius watched her fall, his own pride crumbling into nothingness. The full, irreversible weight of his mistake pressed down on his chest like a mountain. Tonight was the full moon. The enemy armies were already gathering at the borders of Ironmoor, ready to slaughter his defenseless people. Slowly, deliberately, the arrogant Alpha King pushed himself away from the table. He stood up, his limbs trembling, and walked around the cracked stone structure until he stood directly in front of Lyra. He looked at her blind, beautiful face, the silver light pulsing beneath her skin, and for the first time in his life, he understood the depth of his own unworthiness. The ruler of 5 territories, the elite king who had sought a warrior queen, dropped to his knees. He crawled forward until his forehead touched the tips of her worn shoes. "Forgive me, my Luna," Valerius whispered, his voice breaking as he wept, his tears staining the stone floor just as hers had days before. "Take my life, take my title, but save my people from the slaughter. I beg of you." Lyra looked down at the broken king kneeling at her feet. She did not smile. She did not show anger. With a slow, agonizingly cold movement, she reached down and gently ran her fingers through his dark hair. A gesture that offered no warmth, only the terrifying reminder of her absolute power. "Your arrogance is the price you must pay, Your Majesty," she whispered, her words sealing their fate as the distant storm outside broke. And the first rays of the full moon struck the sanctuary ways. The heavy silence of the Forgotten Lands did not break with the thunder of the storm, but with the quiet, crushing realization of absolute ruin. Valerius remained on his knees, his forehead pressed against the frozen, rough stone right where the hem of Lyra's simple cloak brushed the earth. The proud, golden-eyed monarch who had once commanded legions of elite warriors was gone. In his place knelt a man, stripped of his beast, his power, and his pride. His tears, hot and bitter, soaked into the dust, mirroring the very tears Lyra had shed when he cast her out into the cold. "Forgive me, my Luna," Valerius croaked, his voice cracking with an agonizing grief that tore at his throat. "Take my life as payment. Take my crown, my titles, my bloodline. Let the neighboring packs tear me apart on the borders. But please, I beg of you, lift the cursed bond from my people. Do not let them perish in the dark because of my blindness." Lyra looked down at him. Her sightless eyes, once deemed a mark of weakness, held the vast, infinite calm of the cosmos. There was no vengeful joy on her face, no cruel smirk to match the ones he had given her. Slowly, with a deliberate, freezing grace, she extended her hand and let her slender fingers drift through his dark, tangled hair. The touch carried no warmth, no comfort, and no forgiveness. It was the terrifying, absolute weight of a deity acknowledging a broken mortal. "Your arrogance is the price you must pay, Your Majesty," Lyra whispered. Her words did not carry malice, but the absolute finality of cosmic law. Outside the sanctuary, the blackened clouds parted, and the radiant, piercing light of the full moon erupted through the vaulted windows. The trial of the flesh was over. The moon goddess had rendered her judgment. Standing just beyond the heavy oak doors, Saren watched the scene unfold, her hands trembling violently against her velvet gown. The high-born beta, who had plotted so meticulously to take the crown, who had spat on Lyra and called her a parasite, felt a terrifying void open in her chest. She was nothing now. The entire hierarchy she had manipulated was dust. Beside her, Corden stood like a hollow statue. The broad-shouldered leader of Iron Moor, who had treated his Omegas like disposable tools, could only stare at the floor. His mind fracturing under the sheer spiritual pressure radiating from the blind girl he had once locked in a damp cellar. He was no longer a tyrant. He was a fumbling, terrified subordinate, praying the goddess would not notice his existence. "Rise, Valerius," Lyra commanded, her voice echoing with the resonance of 1,000 roaring oceans. Valerius stumbled backward, lifting his gaze. For the first time in his life, he saw beyond the physical world. He saw the soft, divine silver light pulsing beneath her skin, a primordial energy that made the stone walls of the sanctuary vibrate. "I am not the sum of the suffering you inflicted upon me," Lyra stated, her voice steady and clear. "And I refuse to become the monster you were. I will not build my kingdom on your torment." The silence that followed her declaration was absolute. It was not the shallow quiet of shock or apprehension, but the profound silence of an entire race realizing they were in the presence of something completely beyond their comprehension. She had the power to annihilate them with a thought, to leave them as weak, formless prey for the wild beasts of the forest. Yet she chose not to use the cruelest weapon available to her. Valerius looked at her, his heart hammering against his ribs, realizing that her true divinity lay not in her destructive power, but in her capacity to rise above the filth they had thrown at her. 3 weeks passed in the wake of the goddess's revelation. 3 weeks is a mere blink in the lifespan of an immortal, and it is certainly not long enough to erase 7 years of systematic cruelty. It cannot instantly heal the deep, invisible scars carved into a soul by constant degradation. The hollow aches that throb when a person tries to reach for something as simple as peace, trust, for the basic belief that a room will remain safe when they close their eyes. But 3 weeks was enough time for the world of wolves to fundamentally shift. The ancient laws of the Dominion were rewritten. The iron-bound packhouses, once ruled by brutal strength and bloodlines, changed hands. New banners were raised over old stone archways. The wolves, who had spent generations performing performative loyalty to tyranny, discovered, with profound discomfort, that true authority did not come from conquest or political backstabbing. It came from the quiet memory of a blind Omega who had noticed their hidden hearts during the years when noticing cost her everything. Lyra chose the new council herself. She did not select the fiercest alphas or the most politically connected lords. Instead, she elevated an old Omega cook who had once secretly left extra rations at her cleaning station without a word. She appointed a young beta warrior who had once stood between her and Saren's whip, pretending afterward that it had never happened to save himself from execution. She chose an elder who had looked at her with a quiet, solemn respect rather than pity. Small kindnesses, the rare, dangerous sparks of empathy that cost everything in an environment where compassion was considered a treasonous liability.
Lyra remembered every single one of them. The goddess forgot nothing.
The formal restoration of the wolves' spirits occurred on a crisp, overcast morning. Lyra had refused any grand, ostentatious ceremony. She did not want the golden thrones, the velvet cushions, or the hollow praise of nobles who had despised her a month prior. She demanded only the essential, formal words that transformed a cosmic truth into a living reality for her people. As the full court assembled in the great stone hall, Valerius stood a respectful distance behind her, his head bowed. Stripped of his arrogance, but filled with a new, quiet devotion. When the High Elder approached with the ancient crown of the Lycan lineage, asking if she was ready to assume total dominion over the 5 territories, Lyra looked out over the crowd of silent, waiting wolves. "Not yet," she said calmly. The court absorbed her words without a murmur. Valerius did not look surprised. Over the past weeks, he had developed a deep, instinctive understanding of her rhythm. He no longer sought to control her. He simply occupied the space beside her, learning how to exist in her shadow without fear. "I have one final task to complete," Lyra declared. The journey back to the Ironmore packhouse took 2 days. Lyra rode at the front, with Valerius acting as her silent guardian, maintaining a respectful distance to give her space to breathe. The road south felt entirely different this time. The towering, dark pine trees and the heavy gray sky no longer felt like a prison wall closing in. They were merely elements of a world she had conquered through endurance. When they arrived, the grand stone packhouse looked smaller than she remembered. In her memories, the 3-story structure with its charcoal and blood-red banners had loomed like an inescapable mountain of dread. Now, standing beneath the flat afternoon sun, it was just an ordinary building made of mortar, wood, and glass, significant only because of the pain that had occurred within its walls, but possessing no real power over her anymore. "Leave me," Lyra instructed her escort. She walked inside alone, Her footsteps echoed softly along the stone corridors she had spent years scrubbing on her knees. She passed the great hall, where the polished floors still caught the pale light exactly as they used to. She walked down the narrowing back passage until she reached a warped wooden door at the very end of the hall, the storage room. Lyra pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, protesting the intrusion. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it. The broken wooden shelving, the coils of rough rope, the thick scent of dust, damp earth, and neglect. Beneath it all was the lingering, heavy presence of her own long, solitary years of exile. She stepped into the center of the small room and closed her eyes, letting herself feel the weight of the past. She did not weep, nor did she curse the walls. She simply acknowledged the trauma honestly, the way a warrior inspects an old scar received in battle. "It happened here," she whispered to the empty room. "It was real. It cost me a piece of my soul that will never fully return." Then, Lyra turned around and walked out, leaving the heavy wooden door standing wide open. She did not close it. She left the dark, cramped interior of her former prison completely visible and accessible to the corridor. No longer a hidden secret to be ashamed of. It was a small act, almost unnoticeable to an outsider, but it carried the weight of an earthquake. It was an declaration for every Omega who had ever been told they were worthless, for every lower-ranking wolf broken by tyranny, and for every hidden, beautiful thing forced to dwell in darkness. The door was open, and the light had come in. Valerius found her standing by the tall window at the end of the long corridor, staring out at the darkening forest. He approached silently, his footsteps making no sound on the stone floor, and took his place beside her without speaking. Outside, the tree line of Iron Moor stood like a line of dark sentinels against a sky that was slowly turning a deep, rich amber, the color of a winter day finally letting go of its cold light. Lyra felt his presence. The spiritual bond between them, once rejected and broken, had transformed into something else. Not the chaotic, the burning pull of a normal, fated match, but a steady, unyielding anchor. It was the quiet certainty of two souls that had crossed through the underworld and found their rightful place. She turned her head slightly toward him and smiled. It was not the guarded, careful expression she had worn for years to protect herself from insults and blows. It was a real, slow smile that crinkled the corners of her sightless eyes before reaching her lips. It was the smile of a survivor who had finally stopped bracing for the next strike and realized the storm had passed. Valerius looked at her with a reverence he had never shown to any living being. To him, she was the only significant thing in the world, the true axis upon which his entire kingdom turned. From deep within the ancient, snow-covered forest, a lone wolf howled. The sound was long, clear, and silver-bright, carrying a quality of pure light that had nothing to do with sight. It rippled outward across the frozen valleys, crossing the borders of the 5 territories like a stone thrown into a still pond. It reached the furthest packs, traveling through the deep, instinctive channels that connected all wolves beneath the surface of rank. Politics and language. And then the world answered. One voice rose in the distance, then 3, then a dozen, until a chorus of hundreds of wolves echoed from every corner of the Dominion. Packs that had been divided by blood feuds and war for centuries joined together in a single harmonious chord. They answered because the ancient entity within them recognized its creator. The cursed bond was broken. The wolves had found their goddess, and the wilderness rejoiced. The sound filled the stone corridor, vibrating through the floors of the pack house and rising into the amber sky above the pines. Lyra stood at the window, listening to her dominion answer her call, and did not move. On the windowsill of the open storage room behind them, bathed in the fading light of the sunset, the hand-carved wooden wolf token sat where she had left it. Its dark wood was worn smooth at the edges from years of being clutched in terrified fingers. Now the faint silver markings along its surface pulsed with a soft, steady glow. A quiet light in a dark room, certain and eternal. She did not go back to fetch it. The token had done its work. It had kept her anchored when she needed to be found, and its purpose was complete. This was never a story about a helpless Omega who suddenly gained power. This was a story about a goddess who was always powerful, about the terrible cost a soul pays when it is buried beneath the cruelty of others, and what it truly takes to return from the abyss without becoming the very evil you survived. The slap across her face that was meant to break her spirit was the final piece that shattered her disguise. After that moment, nothing in the mortal world could ever make Lyra invisible again.